In a remarkable exercise spanning 15 years, the last survivors of the Great War were interviewed on film. These are unique stories of courage, sacrifice, and tragedy, told by the men and women who were there. These extraordinary interviews have been brought together for the first time. In this film, we hear from the families left behind when fathers, husbands, and brothers went to war. During the 4.5 years of fighting, those on the home front lived with the fear of Zeppelin raids, starvation, and the arrival of the telegram bearing the dreaded words, "Killed in action."
We used to sing the song, "Keep the home fires burning. There's a silver lining through the dark cloud shining. Turn the dark cloud inside out till the boys come home." And my mother always at the end of it said, but some of them will never come home, you see.
I couldn't really imagine him not being there. I thought maybe one day they'll find out they made a mistake, and perhaps he might turn up one day. And even over the years, when people did turn up, I thought, wouldn't it be wonderful if it was Ted?
These are the last voices of World War I. It was harvest time when Britain found herself at war with Germany in August 1914. To begin with, war seemed a glorious adventure to the million men who volunteered to take up arms, and to the families they left behind. Government war propaganda reached even the smallest villages, which were emptied of young men eager to exchange life on the farm for the glamour of life in uniform. Len Whitehead was 7 when his brother George joined the 9th Battalion of the Essex Regiment.
Everybody terribly excited. Nobody more excited than my elder brother George. He was so keen to go. He went into my mother's bedroom. She was not very well at the time and was in bed. And he picked up a stick, tucked it under his arm and marched about the bedroom. "This is how I shall strut about the London parks," he said. Jokingly, of course. And we sang him the little song. "No more will I work in the harvest field to reap the golden corn, but I'm going to join the army and I'm off tomorrow morn." I don't think it occurred to any of them that they might never come back again. It was the sort of glamour of it all. But he did go, and we watched him out of sight with a sort of parcel tucked under his arm with his towel and shaving gear and that sort of thing. Yes, he went.
Civic pride meant that towns and cities competed with one another to attract the most recruits, and new so-called PALS battalions were made up of men from the same street, factory or football team. Being amongst the first wave to volunteer for Lord Kitchener's army was seen as a badge of honour and manhood, and Kathleen Barron felt proud when her elder brother Dick joined up in 1914.
I looked up to him for everything, because I was sure he'd give me the right answer. And just how it was when you're very young, you think your brother's wonderful. And he looked wonderful. He was very handsome. So, poor little me adored him. To see him go was heartbreaking. But, yeah, he had to go.
It didn't take long for the war to come to Britain. As the British Expeditionary Force set sail for the front in 1914, Parks and gardens across the country were transformed into training grounds for the new recruits of Kitchener's Volunteer Army. It was the first glimpse many on the home front had of the brutality of warfare.
We saw these boys, and they were all sticking bayonets into sacks of straw on the trees where children used to play, and they were running towards them and told just whereabouts in the sack that bayonet had to go. So then we knew what that was.
Many of the young men who joined up to fight had to face the heartache of saying goodbye to their girlfriends. In Liverpool, Florence Billington's sweetheart, Ted, had joined the army before the outbreak of war. But as the date of his departure to France loomed nearer, he began to have serious regrets.
He was worried to death, and I was trying to comfort him. I didn't know what to say. I knew nothing about war or anything like that, but all I could do was to tell him to look on the bright side, that there were better days in store when it was all over. But he was quite convinced that he was going to be killed. We were desperately in love with each other, and we made that promise that as soon as the war was over, which was about Christmas, we'd get engaged. It was a promise, and that was it. So that was a promise he went away with in his heart, that it wouldn't be for long.
But it wasn't only single men who volunteered to fight. And for children whose fathers went off to war, it was an especially worrying time. Ruth Armstrong grew up in the village of Tilshead in Wiltshire.
My father said to my mother, "Oh, I've got to go. My group is called up, and I've got to go. I've got to go tomorrow." And of course, she was very, very upset, and us two children, oh well. The end of the world had come for us with Daddy gone. Well, I miss my dad so much. I used to cry every night for him. And I used to say a little prayer and ask God to send him back.
10-year-old Lucy Walter from Kidderminster never forgot the moment when her father wished her a last goodbye.
In the evening, my father said, "I've got to go back now. I'm back to Kidderminster, back to the barracks. And will you walk with me a little way just up the hill? Will you come with me?" And of course I would. We went off down the road and then up this hill. And I was held onto his hand so tight, I can remember that. And when we got to the top, he said, "No, I won't take you any further. You must go back now." And he picked me up against it and put his arm, held me tight to him, and he kissed me. And he put me down and he said, "Well, you must go now. Wave to me at the bottom, won't you?" And I went. I left him there, standing there, and I went down the hill and I kept looking back and he was still there. And I got to the bottom, then I got to turn off to go to where we lived. And I stopped and waved to him, and he waved back. And he gestured like that, as much as, "Go on, you must go home now," sort of thing, you know, gently like that. And then he waved.
With families across the country now separated, there followed an anxious wait as Britain's men went to war. Some would never see their homes and loved ones again. By the spring of 1915, it was clear that Kitchener's men were needed in France without delay, and final preparations were made for their departure. Living close to Salisbury Plain in Wiltshire, Ruth Armstrong heard the Artillery Corps fine-tuning their skills for the battles ahead.
We used to get the guns firing over the village, and it was really terrible because the house used to shake, and that was practicing. of course, and the policeman used to come around on his bike, knock at the doors, and he would say, "Well, missus, open your windows a bit tonight. There's going to be a bit of fun tonight." And of course they fired right over the village. You could hear them whiz over the village. Under the bed my brother used to get. I used to get under the pillows. Used to really shake the houses.
But there was soon a far more frightening vision appearing in the skies above Wiltshire. The Zeppelin. The first air raid on Britain took place on the 19th of January 1915, when 2 Zeppelins dropped bombs on Great Yarmouth, killing 4 civilians. A further 19 raids took place that year, causing widespread damage and claiming 181 lives.
One evening, it was not all that dark. We were sitting indoors playing games on the table, snakes and ladders and all that sort of thing. And we heard a lot of screaming, and we all run out. "Oh, there's a Zeppelin coming. Oh, Kaiser's coming." Everybody got out in the road screaming, and they didn't know what to make of it. And my brother got all worried about it, and he said, "Oh, that old Kaiser's going to jump out of that Zeppelin and take the lot of us. What are we going to do?" And then my little friend said, "We ought to go and get the policeman." I said, "What can the policeman do?" I said that if the Kaiser comes down, he'll take the policeman as well. And my mother got a bit worried herself, I think, so she said, "The Germans will never have you. They will never have you." She said, "We're not going to live under German rule. No way." She said, so I said, "Well, what will you do, Mummy?" Well, she said, "It's an awful thing to tell you, but she said I should wait till you're asleep, and I should put your pillow over your head, and then I should do the same to myself. The Germans are not going to rule me, nor my children."
To begin with, Britain's air defences were weak, and few Zeppelins were shot down. When they were, there was little sympathy for the crew on board.
It was like a long silver pencil, all on fire, right up in the sky. And the neighbours was hooraying and Germans, you know. I said, "But they're men burning alive." All I could think of, they were burning alive. And I rushed indoors. I couldn't stand it.
This propaganda film recreated the destructive power of the airship, the indiscriminate nature of their bombs earning them the nickname the Baby Killers. They were scenes familiar to 10-year-old Madge Main-Donald, who was caught in an air raid in London.
It was the people screaming that got me down. 1 or 2 had lost their child or their partner or something, and they were calling and trying to find each other, and everybody was laying on the floor. We weren't standing up, and people were trying to, and calling, John, where are you, John? Oh, for Christ's sake, John, speak to me, and things like that, and I'm praying, please God. Well, I couldn't see the sense of that. I really couldn't see the sense of that.
There were only a few safe air raid shelters and little protection for civilians, yet after the initial panic, the reaction to the raids was one of fierce resistance. The random killing of women and children was a propaganda gift which helped strengthen national unity. After most raids, it was business as usual, and all feelings of fear were suppressed, even amongst the children.
We got up in the morning, and I went to school, and I got late, because we'd only had about half an hour's sleep. I got told off for being late, which was very unusual, because I was a very punctual child. And I never said a word. And I couldn't talk about it.
Back on the Western Front, in the autumn of 1915, the Allies launched their first major attempt to break through the German lines near the French coal mining town of Loos. It was the first real test for Kitchener's volunteers. It was here that Len Whitehead's elder brother George went over the top. His body was never found.
The first we knew of it, of his being killed, was a pal of his who joined up at much the same time, wrote to my mother, "Dear Mrs. Whitehead, I am writing to tell you your son George has been killed." My mother, of course, burst into tears. "Don't read any more," she said. And after a time, when she calmed down a little, she said to me, "Go and tell your father." My father was ploughing in a field near to the farmhouse, and I waited for him to finish about with his plough and 2 horses. "George has been killed," I told him. And he didn't answer, but left his horses all steaming in the mild late October weather, and we walked back in silence to the house. When we got to the house, he went to the bottom of the stairs and called up, "That's all right, ain't it?" He made no attempt to go up to comfort my mother, but went into the kitchen, sat in his wooden armchair and put his arms on the table and his head on his arms for a little while, wept, I think. Then he went back to his ploughing.
The Battle of Lewes had been a failure, and British casualties totalled around 20,000 men. But it was just a foretaste of things to come. With so many men away at the front, women began to enter the workforce in large numbers, often having to do the jobs previously undertaken by skilled and semi-skilled men. By 1917, 1 million women were doing what had once been men's jobs in the munitions factories. To begin with, Daisy Collingwood was keen to do her patriotic duty.
I felt when I was working on munitions, I really thought, well, I haven't got any brothers to go and fight, I'm doing the next best thing, and I was quite pleased to be able to do it.
The pressure to meet production targets meant that 12-hour shifts day and night were common.
I had never stayed up all night in my life, and I started on night work. I never thought I'd get through that shift. But I did. Like everything else, it's surprising what you can do when you've got to.
But the health and welfare of the women was often sacrificed in the production drive. Around 1,000 munitions workers would die, many of them in factory explosions, like this one at Silvertown in London's East End. Daisy Collingwood was a lucky survivor, but was so mentally distressed she was unable to continue working.
It was as though the whole world shook with the noise of the explosion. I've never heard a noise like it. But of course, not only me, all those working in the building were all shot around. The place was just a shambles.
To make ends meet, many families began to send their young children out to work to help pay for the food essential to their survival. Over 500,000 were withdrawn early from school to be used as child labour. At the age of 9, Dennis Gilfeather began work in the Dundee jute mills.
We're starting at 6 in the morning until 6 at night. You had 2 breaks through the day, 9 to 10 and 1 to 2. And it was 5.5 days. You worked 54 hours a week and you got £1 and a penny. But that was gold in these days. I was a very, very proud boy when I got my pay and took it home to my mum. I knew it should make her happy, and it certainly made me very happy. And I felt I was 6 feet tall instead of 5 feet 6.
Children who remained in school were also expected to do their bit for the war effort. In Wiltshire, Ruth Armstrong's teacher encouraged her pupils to take up knitting for the cause.
We made scarves and balaclavas and socks and gloves. I'd done scarves because I wasn't much of a hand at knitting. And then she wanted us to write to the soldiers out in the front, you know, and to cheer them up. And I got an answer from one of them. And he told me, he said how very happy he was to get my letter. And he hadn't had a letter from anyone for 6 weeks. And he had this letter from me and how it cheered him up.
In 1916, 14-year-old Kathleen Barron began work as a pianist in her local cinema, accompanying newsreels as they flickered on the silver screen above her.
I so loved playing the piano. I got this job, much to my amazement, and it was the silent films, of course, and all the different films about the war, and I had to play accordingly. I was told that I had a lot of expression in my playing, which is touch, gentle touch, and yet firmness of the fingers. And according to what was on, so I would look and play just from my mind, no music, what that would coincide with that film. If it was bombing, a terrible, terrible fight, I would know what sort of music to play.
Kathleen couldn't have known it, but she would soon be playing along with some of the most remarkable images ever captured on film. On the 1st of July 1916, the Battle of the Somme began. The government was so confident of victory, it allowed cameramen to film the troops in action. 20 million would watch these scenes of trench warfare, some real, some reconstructed, in cinemas all over Britain. For the first time, families back home glimpsed the horrors of trench warfare.
It almost seemed unreal to me. You know, it couldn't be going on. But of course it was. And the terror of it affected me. And yet I could feel the sadness and the horror from the audience. You could feel it.
The battle raged on until the end of November. In 5 months of fighting, over 600,000 British and Allied soldiers were killed, wounded, or taken prisoner. In towns and villages that had raised PALS battalions, the effects were devastating. Entire communities went into mourning as across the country, the dreaded telegram was delivered with an ever-increasing regularity. By the winter of 1916, the spirit of patriotism that had once gripped the country had all but disappeared. The losses on the Somme had shocked the nation, and every day those at home lived in fear of the arrival of an official letter or telegram bearing bad news.
People used to dread seeing the little telegraph boys come on the bikes. It was nearly always to say that somebody had been killed. It made you afraid of that telegraph boy coming to the door. You didn't want to see him. You were hoping he'd keep away. You didn't want him because he always had bad news.
In Liverpool, Kathleen Barron and her family waited nervously for news about her brother Dick.
In those days, the postman knocked on the door, and my mother used to say, "Go and fetch the letters," which I did. And if there was one that was a buff colour, and it had on His Majesty's Service on it, my mother couldn't open the letters. And she used to say, "You open them, you open them." So I had to open them.
The letter most feared was Army Form B10482. It contained the blunt message, "Killed in action," and was now being received by tens of thousands of families. Dennis Gilfeather's father was killed in France, fighting with the King's Own Scottish Borderers.
When this happened, when the official news came through the door, my mother had the wee boy in a high chair, and we were round the table, and she was attending to us. When the telegram boy came, Mother went to the door and she got this telegram. She'd opened it, looked at it, collapsed on the floor. And the eldest boy said, "Get through to Mrs. Lawson and get her." So this was a neighbour. I had knocked on her door and she come out, and she says, "What's the matter, son?" I said, "My mum's collapsed." And when she came through and she attended my mother and washed her face, gave her a cup of tea. And then suddenly the news was out now. The news that my father wasn't going to see him again. You're stuck with that. This thing didn't leave your mind for years. You're not going to see your dad again.
It was very difficult for those back home to come to terms with the sudden loss, with no body to bury and little or no information on the circumstances of death.
The postman brought a letter, and my mother opened it, and she sat there, and all she said was, "Oh, he's dead." And then she did begin to cry. I don't remember crying. I felt so stunned I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe that I'd never see him again. But oh dear, I did cry at night, because I remembered my father always tucked me up and he always kissed my forehead and said, "Good night, Lulu, God bless you." Every night, he never failed. And I did miss that so much. I really did. I suppose in a way I was heartbroken. I was.
By 1917, the main German strategy to win the war was through a naval blockade, sinking the Allied merchant fleet and starving Britain into submission. In just 1 month, German U-boats destroyed 371 merchant ships bringing food to Britain. With 2/3 of the country's food supply coming from overseas, there would soon be a crisis on the home front.
The only time we had a meal really was on the Sunday, when we used to have a dinner on a Sunday. That was practically the only real meal we had in the week. And the bread was black, almost black. Couldn't get white bread, never. And there wasn't much of anything. And people starved. Did you know people starved? If you were hungry, you didn't tell anybody, you didn't go begging. Why would you? People didn't, they had their pride. I wouldn't have told anybody I was hungry.
My mother, I don't know how she managed. We were starving. If the war went on another 4 months, I don't know what would have happened. My mother, she was done everything she can for both of us, my little brother and me. She'd done everything she could. There was nothing to see her sit at the table with an empty plate. Mummy, you're not eating. Well, I'm not hungry. Whatever she had was for my brother and myself. And my mother and grandmother used to go out in the fields with the permission of the farmers, of course, and pick the greens off the turnips and the swedes, take them home and cook them with potatoes and mash it up with margarine. That was our Sunday dinner. Mother used to say, eat it up and imagine that you're having a nice roast dinner. And we made ourselves believe it. And it went down good because we were hungry.
A production drive in the countryside was desperately needed to help make the country more self-sufficient in food. But many of the young farm workers had been amongst the first wave of volunteers to go to the front, and with them had gone most of the horses of rural England, now being commandeered for service by the army.
When they took the horses, it upset me very much. We only had 4. 2 of them were beautiful Shire-type horses. They took those and another bay mare which wasn't quite as big. Left us just with 1 horse. Meant an awful lot to us, the horses. Boxer, Duke and Violet were their names. Never saw them again, of course.
According to government propaganda and popular legend, the Women's Land Army helped overcome the food production crisis as middle-class volunteers gave up their comfortable suburban lives to work on the farms. In fact, few were prepared to make the sacrifice, and even fewer farmers wanted them. They were still only 16,000 strong by the end of the war, and they made little impact. But alongside them came a fresh supply of manpower, the Army Agricultural Labour Corps, many of whom were disabled ex-soldiers, like 19-year-old George Louth from Hampshire. George had fought in the Battle of the Somme and was sent home from the trenches, suffering from partial deafness and nervous exhaustion.
I didn't know how a potato grew, never mind about haymaking, and we went to this farm and we was there a fortnight, and he sent us back. Said we were no good. So the officer said to me, well, look, he said, if you can't do anything on the land, it's no good you stopping here. You'll have to go back to France again. I said, oh no. I said, is there some tractor drivers being wanted somewhere? Is that what you want to do? I said, yes, sir.
At least George had now escaped the nightmare of trench warfare.
I felt free, didn't I, after all that trauma? It disappeared. It disappeared altogether. As though it was yesterday.
1917 saw some of the bitterest fighting of the war, and the dreadful battles of Arras and Passchendaele have since become synonymous with suffering on an unimaginable scale. As the war dragged on, the tragic news of losses continued to reach people across the land. Before he left for the front, Florence Billington's sweetheart, Ted, had promised they would get engaged at the end of the war. It was a promise he would be unable to keep.
I was working at the Palace Hotel, Buxton, and one of the porters came up with this letter from the War Office, official looking. When I saw it, my heart sank a little bit. I thought it must be something very, very important. And when I opened it, it was to say that they regretted to tell me that Edward had been killed. The letters from me were found on his body, and that's why they could find out where I was. I couldn't really imagine him not being there. I couldn't imagine it. I thought maybe one day they'll find out they made a mistake, and perhaps he might turn up one day.
Grief could have a devastating physical impact on women who were already weakened by overwork and starvation. A contemporary survey found that 1 in 8 war widows died within a year of their soldier husbands. 6 months after losing her husband, Dennis Gilfeather's mother was seriously ill in hospital.
You think that the whole world's changing, that the sunshine's leaving your life. Your mother's in bed and she's very ill. As she's now, you can't go, Mum. You must, you know, all love you so much. And she looked at me and she said, you look after them if anything happens to me. You look after the bairn and Dan. That was the 2 youngest. You've been graded up and you have to stay strong. But your stomach was tumbling with nerves and the worry in case you lost your mum.
Dennis was lucky. His mother survived, and the extra money he earned working in the jute mills helped to keep his family together. By 1918, the war had entered its final phase. The German offensive of the spring had failed, and the Allies were now pushing towards victory. At home, the introduction of rationing and one of the best harvests for years had helped quell the food shortages. 4 years of suffering and privation were at last coming to an end. But for many on the home front, the end of the war was just the beginning of a new and unexpected chapter in their lives. In November 1918, the guns on the fields of Flanders at last fell silent, and across Britain, crowds turned out onto the streets to mark the occasion. But for the families of the 750,000 British men killed in the fighting, there was little to celebrate. Len Whitehead's older brother George had been killed in 1915.
My mother was very sad. She didn't want to take part in any celebrations or anything like that. We didn't hear the armistice had been signed until very late in the afternoon. We were isolated on a farm, you see. But my mother didn't take any part in any celebration. One of her precious family wasn't come home, and it made her sad, of course. You see, we used to sing the song, "Keep the Home Fires Burning." Everybody's heard that, of course. Keep the home fires burning while the hearts are yearning. Though the lads are far away, they dream of home. There's a silver lining through the dark cloud shining. Turn the dark cloud inside out till the boys come home. And then my mother always finished up, but some of the poor boys won't ever come home. And so it was always there, the fact that he would not come home again.
Kathleen Barron's brother Dick was one of those lucky enough to make it home, although it would take him many years to recover from a case of severe dysentery that had nearly killed him.
I would pray, quite believing that God would bring him back. And he did. Of course, he came back very ill, terribly ill. But he came back. I've never seen my mother look so beautiful as she did when she saw her son. it was the elation, the lovely feeling of seeing him. She really did. I couldn't believe it. She looked so lovely. He wasn't quite the, what shall I say, happy-go-lucky, fun-loving person that he was. You see, he'd altered. I mean, he'd suffered a lot, nearly died, and that alters people, doesn't it? Because he wasn't really quite well, even then. Far from well, really. But there you are, we had him back. We had him home.
After her sweetheart Ted was killed earlier in the war, Florence Billington married a sailor called Sid. But she never forgot Ted and the promise that he was unable to keep, that he would come home and marry her after the war.
Couldn't settle down, thinking of him. That's what it was. It made me all unsettled. I made up my mind that one day I would go over there and try to find the place where he'd fallen, which I did. I didn't find a place where I saw the memorial there and his name and everything. But I thought about him a lot, and he came to me several times in spirit. Yes, he told me he kept thinking of me, and he loved me with all his heart, and that was the one thing he didn't like to leave me when he went. But he did. He came back a few times, and has done over the years. So that's how it is.
For many fathers returning home to their families, it was a wonderful occasion, tinged only with the sadness that they had missed the joys of watching their children grow up. But some could never readjust to the normality of family life.
My father and mother was never the same again. And it happened to so many families. After my father had been home some little time, things seemed to, I don't know, go funny between my father and mother. And I found out afterwards that he had been accusing her of carrying on the soldier. And a New Zealander, he reckoned it was, because we were surrounded with New Zealanders. And he found this letter, you see. Dear Kitty, I'm so sorry I haven't seen you lately, but I still got the children's comics for them. Hope to see you soon. Lots of love, Con. Of course, she got in an awful temper about it because she told him straight she, was a lot of lies. But he wouldn't listen. He got it in his head, and he was a changed man, and what he wanted to do was clear out and take me. And he wanted to, anyway, in the end they parted. And I broke my heart. Oh, I broke my heart.
After being sent home from the trenches with partial deafness and nervous exhaustion, George Louth spent the remainder of the war working on the land in Dorset. There he met Ella, the daughter of his landlady, and after an 8-month courtship, George proposed.
I said, will you marry me? She was shook. So then we decided, when we went indoors, and we gave the news to the mother-in-law, and she clapped. She clapped because she never had a son-in-law like that before.
George and Ella married on Armistice Day, November the 11th, 1918.
Got married, and as we came out, out of there, Blairford, we see all the flags flying. We thought it was for us. And it wasn't. It was the Armistice Day, 11 o'clock. But we got married. And we done it now. We did that then, married for 70 years.
The hunger and hardship on the home front will always be overshadowed by the far greater suffering and death of soldiers on the front line. But for those who lived through it, the devastating impact the war had on the family life of the nation will never be forgotten